Coming up on Arirang News, the South Korean economy grew 1.6% in the first quarter. That's back to levels seen before the pandemic and is one of the fastest growth rates in the world. South Korea's recent rise in coronavirus cases is starting to lead to more critical cases and deaths. The recent case numbers have been more between friends and family than in the clusters seen before. And the Foreign Ministry in Seoul summons a Japanese diplomat to protest Japan's latest false claim to South Korea's Dokdo Islands. Seoul says it'll respond sternly to any provocations over the territory. It's 5 p.m. here in Seoul. Thanks for joining us on Arirang News. I'm Devin Whiting. Data show South Korea's economy is recovering apace. The first 3 months of this year saw strong growth back to pre-pandemic levels, a full quarter earlier than expected. Kim Sung-min has the details.
The Bank of Korea said on Friday that South Korea's first quarter GDP growth was up 1.6% from the previous quarter. Beating the market consensus of around 1% growth for Q1 this year, the country has recovered back to its pre-pandemic level. And it has managed this 1 quarter earlier than previously forecast. The figure also marks the third straight quarter of GDP growth. In fact, excluding China and India, South Korea's recovery showed the fastest pace out of the world's largest economies, growing faster than the US and Canada. On year, first quarter real GDP expanded 1.8%. The growth came from all sectors, from consumption to exports and investment.
Taking a look at the contribution from consumption, both private and government spending increased from minus 0.8 percentage points to 0.8 percentage points.
Exports, which account for around half of the country's GDP, were up 1.9%, backed by the strong performance of the automobile and mobile industries. Facility investment rose 6.6% based on increases in machinery and transportation equipment. Considering the current recovery trend, the central bank expects the growth to be bigger in 2021 than the previously forecast 3.2%, possibly up to growth around the mid-3% level. The improvement in the global economy, largely accelerated by the U.S. recovery, has had a positive impact on the South Korean economy. Exports during the first 20 days in April, which increased by almost 50%, further boost expectations. To further consolidate this current trend, the government has pledged for strong support, including the fast release of the supplementary budget and a nationwide sales event. More detailed economic plans for the second half of the year are expected to come in June. Kim Sung-min, Arirang News.
South Korea announced last year that it plans to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050, a goal President Moon reaffirmed in the climate summit with President Biden. To achieve this goal by the target date, one major task is to build more infrastructure for electric cars so that they're a viable option for more people. The main thing is to build more charging stations. Bae-ji takes a look at what's being done on that front.
To expand the charging infrastructure for electric cars in South Korea, auto giant Hyundai Motor recently opened charging stations on major highways across the country. Through this ultra-fast 350-kilowatt charging station at a rest stop in Hwasong City, electric cars can get their batteries up to 80% charged in less than 20 minutes. Even with just 5 minutes of charging, the cars are able to travel up to 100 kilometers. Starting April 15th, 12 fast EV charging stations equipped with a total of 72 chargers are being opened at rest stops across the nation.
Starting with this charging station, Hyundai Motor Group plans to boost the electric car charging situation in South Korea. We hope this will help increase the number of electric cars on the roads.
One driver that uses the facility says he hopes to see more of these charging stations along highways.
It is convenient because it charges faster than other charging stations.
Rest stops aren't the only places that need more electric car charging stations. An industry expert says it's also important to have slow charging stations in parking lots and apartment buildings so drivers can charge their cars overnight.
Slow charging stations should be located in all apartment complexes. No one should feel guilty about having to charge their car for more than 6 hours, or need to worry about going downstairs to allow other people to use the chargers. What's important is to have the right kind of chargers in the right places.
According to a Seoul National University research team, petrol and diesel cars emit about 200 grams of carbon dioxide for each kilometer of travel. whereas electric cars only emit about 94 grams. That amount comes from the carbon emitted manufacturing the electric cars and from producing electricity. But even considering this, they still produce fewer emissions. As of last year, the number of chargers in the country reached 64,000. By 2025, the government plans to have more than 500,000 chargers in apartment complexes and along highways. 배은지, Arirang News.
Time now for an in-depth look at the market news this afternoon. And for that, I'm joined on the line by Mr. Daniel Yu, global strategist at Yuanta Securities. Mr. Yu, good afternoon. Thank you for coming on.
Good afternoon.
Well, stocks in New York overnight saw a gain for tech shares ahead of earnings from the big companies there. But in other sectors, things were more subdued. So while the Nasdaq was up almost 0.9%, the Dow slipped by about 0.2%. What's the story in the global markets?
Yes, on Monday, S&P 500 added about 0.2% to a record of 4,188. And the growth stock-heavy Nasdaq gained by 0.9%, hitting 14,139, which is the first record close since the February 12th. But as you said, Dow Jones was down slightly by 0.2%. And as for the small mid-cap, also showed some rise. All in all, if you look at the earnings, it is doing very well. The first quarter numbers are all coming in for most of the major companies. And more than 80% of these numbers coming in are better than expected. And clearly indication of the economic recovery is happening for USA. Most of people are saying that U.S. economy is likely to recover most significantly in the second quarter of this year. Q-on-Q number is expected to rise by 9% plus, maybe as high as 10.5%, according to Goldman Sachs. So all in all, it's showing a very significant recovery, and that is resulting into overall market recovery that continues since the end of March, beginning of April this year. We think that the economic recovery front would be doing continually better. In terms of the Y-o-Y number, we expect that number to continue to improve until the first quarter of next year rather than second quarter of this year. So therefore, we expect the overall equity market for USA to showing a rising trend despite some concern about the tapering. This will have a positive implication for global economies and global equity market as well. We are seeing overall market seems to showing similar trend, not just U.S., but Europe as well as Korea.
Well, here in Korea, shares closed a fair bit lower today ahead of the Fed's latest meeting. Individual investors seeming to see a chance to buy, but institutions and foreigners were net sellers. The Kospi, though, did hold on to that 3,200 level. Tell us about the local market.
Yes, Kospi slipped very slightly. It closed at 3,215.4, down by about 0.07%. But Kosdaq was down slightly more by 0.9%, hitting 1,021. If you look at the COVID-19 cases, it has declined quite sharply to 512 cases. All in all, we think that the Korean economy is showing a good trend in terms of economic recovery because of very strong export numbers as well as domestic consumption seems to be fairly stable. Continued positive implication of economic growth numbers as into the earnings growth number for Korea. We think that the Korean equity market Kospi is likely to rise well above 3,500 territories within this year. If it shows a bit more of a bubble per se, it might even hit well above 4,000. Earnings growth rate for Korea is the strongest out of all the major economies. Economic growth rate also fairly stable. Only concern is the consumer debt level and domestic consumption numbers. But as long as the interest rate remains to be low, we think that is not too much of a problem, and the continuous export growth numbers would have positive implications for Korean equity market.
Well, staying here in Korea, interestingly, next week, the regulators are going to end a ban on short selling that they imposed last March at the start of the pandemic. So to some, this is a cause for concern because short selling can actually drive the market lower when things get rough. But on the other hand, it's a standard tool in the industry for hedging. So what do you think the effect will be if and when short selling resumes next Monday?
I don't think that this will have much of a big implications. Might even create some short selling in some specific industries, such as biosector, given very heavy valuations. But overall, short selling ban removed would have a bit of a more positive implication in time of period of where earnings growth is very strong. I think that lasting for such a long period of time, most of the people were uncertain about economic recovery, earnings growth rate, all in all. They were very doubtful about the reflationary environment. But now everyone is agreeing with the reflationary environment, that economy is improving, the overall prices are going up, and inflation is somewhat there, meaning that short selling removal is the right timing per se. So if you short sell companies and it shows a very strong recovery in earnings or sales growth numbers, then you are locked in for a huge losses. Without short selling is a very, very difficult way of making money. So a lot of hedge fund uses it, but usually when economy is a very strong steam and the equity market in rising trend, fully hedging is very difficult, and stock picking becomes very difficult. So I don't think that this removal of short selling is going to be any significant issue. Also, Korean government is going to put a heavy penalty for illegal short selling. Therefore, we think that it's going to be based on fundamental, and the fundamental looks good.
Well, speaking of reflation and recovery, in the first quarter, the South Korean economy grew 1.6%. So that's a sign that it is recovering nicely. Consumer spending rising too. Tell us about the state of the economy and this first quarter performance.
Yes, South Korea advanced by about 1.6% on quarter in the first 3 months to March, following 1.2% growth in the previous period, compared to the market consensus of 1.0%. So overall numbers are in a rising trend, so 1.2% to 1.6%. Usually if that happens, then the equity market tends to do well. If you look at specifically some of the numbers in details, the private consumption grew by 1.1%. As expenditures on durable goods and non-durable goods increased. And also government expenditure rose by 1.7%. Net trade contributed positively to the growth as well, exporting surging by 1.9%. As you know, that the motor vehicles and mobile phones and semiconductor all showing a very positive growth numbers. We think that there's a bit of a concern about the domestic consumption side. Longer term, in the short term, it looks good, but in a longer term, because of a very high the debt level to GDP numbers of the consumers, we think that domestic consumption growth rate is not going to exceed much more than what we saw of 1.1%, and probably lowering down the overall growth rate of Korea. I think that though, however, export numbers are very positive, and global economy is recovering, so Korea's dependency on export will shine, and therefore economic growth rate will show reasonable numbers going forward.
Well, we can look forward to that. I hope, Mr. Yuh, thank you for sharing all of your insights with us today, as always. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
President Moon Jae-in has expressed hope for closer ties between the South Korean vaccine producer SK Bioscience and the U.S. company Novavax, whose vaccine is now in the approval process. President Moon met Tuesday at the Blue House with Novavax CEO Stanley Erck. Novavax has partnered with SK Bioscience to produce 40 million doses of its vaccine.
한국 국민들은 노바백스 백신에 큰 기대를 걸고 있습니다. 특히 영국 변이 바이러스와 남아공 변이 바이러스가 출현한 이후에 임상 시험이 이루어졌기 때문에 그 두 변이 바이러스에 대해서도 높은 효과가 있다는 것이 확인되었다고 들었습니다. 앞으로도 양사의 협력이 더 발전해 나갈 수 있도록 정부가 긴밀히 협력해 나가겠습니다.
Noting that the vaccine's easy storage and long shelf life, Moon said he hopes the vaccine's efficacy and safety can be proven through the authorization process before production begins. Novavax is yet to get approval for emergency use. There was initially an issue with securing production materials, but that has been resolved. Local production is expected to start in June. South Korea's daily cases have been hovering around the 600s for some time, and this is causing cases of critically ill patients to rise too. This comes as the health authorities are planning to change the current social distancing model. Kim Do-yeon has the details.
With cases hovering around the 600s for several weeks, the number of critically ill patients may be starting to rise as well. There are currently 156 patients that are under intensive care, as 24 more became critically ill on Tuesday.
The number of critically ill patients and deaths rises 1 or 2 weeks after daily cases increase. So with a relatively high number of cases for some time, critical cases and deaths could see a rising trend. To prevent critical cases as much as possible, we will strengthen the treatment system and preventive measures at high-risk facilities.
This comes as government has set this week as a special virus prevention week and is assessing the current measures to possibly update the distancing model starting next week. With the growing number of critically ill patients and the medical infrastructure's capacity directly affecting the distancing model, the government is being cautious in the new updates. As for the daily number of cases, the country reported 512 new cases of COVID-19 on Tuesday, of which 477 were local transmissions. The numbers on Mondays and Tuesdays are usually lower than the rest of the week, and by midweek, the cases could rise into the 700s if they follow the trend seen in the past few weeks. Currently, cluster infections are down by 15%, while these individual infections account for almost 45% of infections, an all-time high for the category. The country also reported 86 more variant cases on Tuesday. So far, there are a total of 535 cases of the known main variants, and the variant first found in the UK accounts more than 460 of those.
To figure out the best isolation period for the variants, we analyzed the transmissible period of the UK variant. As a result, the transmissible period for the UK variant was no different from non-variant cases.
With the findings, the authorities said UK variant patients will no longer have to undergo a longer isolation period than non-variant patients. Kim Do-yeon, Arirang News.
The South Korean government has lodged a strong protest against the false territorial claims made by Japan in its latest diplomatic blue book. That publication, released on Tuesday, says that Korea's Dokdo Islets belong to Japan. Yoon Jung-min reports.
Seoul lodged a strong protest on Tuesday against the latest false claim by Tokyo to South Korea's easternmost Dokdo Islets, urging Japan to immediately withdraw the claim. It stressed once again that Dokdo belongs to South Korea historically, geographically, and by international law.
We have made it clear once again that the Korean government will respond sternly to any provocations by the Japanese government when it comes to Dokdo.
Regarding the so-called comfort women issue, Seoul again called on Tokyo to demonstrate through action the kind of sincere reflection on its past that it has expressed in words. To relate these protests, the ministry summoned the deputy chief of mission at the Japanese embassy in Seoul, Hirohisa Soma. Earlier in the day, Japan revealed its latest diplomatic blue book in which it repeated its false claim on Dokdo. While describing Seoul as an important neighbor, Japan reiterated that responsibility falls on the South Korean government when it comes to compensating the Korean victims of Japan's wartime sexual enslavement and forced labor. It expressed deep regrets over a Seoul court ruling in January that ordered the Japanese government to compensate the Korean victims of the so-called comfort women system. On the issue of denuclearization on the Korean peninsula, the report emphasized cooperation with Seoul and Washington. Youn Yuh-jung, Arirang News.
The Academy Award won this week by the actress Youn Yuh-jung was the first for a South Korean in an acting category, but there were a few other important firsts for Asian people in the film industry. Our culture correspondent Kim Bo-kyung has this report.
This year's Oscars were full of firsts. Chloe Zhao made history by becoming the first Asian woman to win Best Director for her film Nomadland, and just the second female director ever to win the award. Steven Yeun was the first Asian American actor to earn a nomination for the top acting prize. And Youn Yuh-jung clinched the Best Supporting Actress award for the first time for a Korean actress. She is the first Asian actress to win that award since the 1950s. The cast of Minari receiving global recognition has much significance, given that even though director Bong Joon-ho's Parasite won big last year, none of the film's cast got the nod. Critics say Yoon's win especially could serve as a stepping stone to offer broader opportunities for Asian actors and lead to more appreciation in the future.
It would mean, it would tell Hollywood and other people that you can hire, Korean and Asian actors and, have them in a movie that will resonate with people all over the world.
An Asian Japanese actress received the award in 1958 with films Sayonara, but most of the times she smiled and showed how hard she tried to learn English, which some could say is quite a limited, Orientalist view. But Yoon, she just showed herself in Minari. She didn't think about how she'll be seen to others, but was just herself.
Yoon also shattered the prejudice that an actress's career is very much related to their age by winning her award at the age of 73.
Dubbed the Meryl Streep of Korea, she demonstrated that if actresses have enough ability, there will always be roles for them. There will be a big change in the film industry and the way it has been using actresses.
Known for challenging herself with unique interpretations of any role she's assigned, as shown in the low-budget independent film The Bucket Lady, critics say that her life could be a textbook for actors who want to pursue their own identity in acting. Kim Bo-kyung, Arirang News.
That brings us to the end of this newscast. Thank you for watching. More live news coming your way at 7 p.m. Korea time.